So I have often said that when it comes to the Edinburgh Fringe, this theatrical experience is more of a marathon than a sprint. Today, I take that back. Oh my god, hey, welcome back to my theatre-themed YouTube channel. My name is MickeyJo and I am obsessed with all things theatre, which is why I go every August to the Edinburgh Festival Fringe and review as much theatre, musicals, plays, burlesque, comedy, everything adjacent to that as I have the time to as a independent theatre critic. And this year I went for 10 days and I've spent the last few weeks sharing little reviews of the 60 shows that I saw across some of my other social media channels, because 60 short videos uploaded to YouTube would be a lot. And if you want to watch those reviews in full, you can find them over on Threads, which I shared via Instagram. I also shared them via X and also posted on TikTok. But not everyone has those platforms, and as well as wanting to hear about those shows, a lot of people have been curious about how I would rank everything. So today I am going to be ranking all 60 of the shows that I saw at this year's Edinburgh Fringe Festival in 60 minutes. I've already put them in order and I'm going to tell you about each one, and I have 1 minute to review each show. Are you nervous? I'm nervous. The mathematically minded among you will have realised that means I'm about to be sat here for 1 hour talking about shows that I saw earlier this month at the Fringe. And I will do my best to edit in supplementary information afterwards, but it's unlikely I'm going to be able to conjure all of the names of the playwrights as I go through these and all of the personal details and the individuals involved who helped bring the thing to the stage, but you can find many of those in the full reviews. Now, if you like listening to me talk about theatre, you're in the right place. Make sure you're subscribed. If you're watching this video here on YouTube, turn on those notifications so you don't miss my upcoming theatre reviews. And if you're listening to this on a podcast platform, hello to you. Make sure you're following me wherever you found it. And if you found yourself at the Edinburgh Fringe this year and you saw any fantastic theatre, please share all of your thoughts down in the comments section. For now though, here's everything that I loved and everything I did not. Starting with the lowest, number 60. Least favourite thing I saw, Willy's Candy Spectacular at the Pleasance Dome. This was a musical parody of the actual events that unfolded a few months ago in Glasgow when there was this AI created Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory experience, but it was incredibly threadbare and disappointing, and it became a huge thing on social media. And I really don't see the point in satirising that with seemingly as little care as went into planning the event itself. Like, it kind of puts you in no position to make fun of this event if the musical feels just as threadbare. They had a lot of actual writers involved, and the only real thing of value about this was some of the compositions were very catchy. The song Willy's Candy Spectacular. They had the actual Oompa Loompa Kirsty Patterson stood there aimlessly with this very terrible character arc. The whole thing just awful. I resented the very presence of this at the Edinburgh Fringe and everything that it stood for. It was completely aimless. I was not a fan of this one. That is 1 minute. I could go on for 10 more minutes. This is going to be very challenging. Immediately, let's go into the next one. Edge of Time at Underbelly Cowgate. This was a musical. It felt more like a piece. And if I'd asked ChatGPT to devise a solo show for a young woman, I feel like this is what it would have come out with. She entered in a thunderclap in a white slip, giving you a few moments of silent physical theatre while miming the attempt at a suicide attempt, because this was about a historical real person, a real woman who committed suicide back in the 60s, I believe, after publishing a groundbreaking piece of academic study about the effect of motherhood on young women and this other, then unheard perspective about how this might be affecting people. The music was a little bit sort of like sad Eurovision song-esque. It had no business being a musical because the songs did nothing. It just, all the different elements brought together here felt a little bit disconnected from each other. It was a very committed performance, which I appreciated, but I found very little else to enjoy about this. That is once again the alarm for 1 minute. Next up, You and It, a new musical. Okay, this is, I believe, a Korean musical that had been translated into English. I don't know if that translation bears some of the fault here. I immediately knew this was going to be very difficult to sit through when we started with the lines, this is a love story, this is a story about love, this is a story about love. Just very repetitive. The premise is interesting because this is about a man whose wife has died in a car accident, which is revealed to us via a comically loud car crash sound effect, which was probably not the desired intention, and she is replaced with a robot, a super realistic AI robot who at first is learning how to mimic his wife's behavior, and she's feeling a little bit unsettled. She doesn't know that she's a robot, and she's trying to come to terms with a return to her home, but then she starts to change things, and she starts to try and optimize everything and make it more efficient, and this is not what he wants. He wants to just cling to the past. Interesting things said there about grief, and some beauty in the composition, but it just has a massive words problem. The lyrics, the script, it wasn't good, I'm sad to say. That is a minute. Oh, okay. Next up, we're still in the 2-star review territory here, by the way, because none of these were completely irredeemable, although Willie's Candy Spectacular was close. Next up, House of Cleopatra. Immersive nightclub dance floor style musical. But who decided it was a good idea to make one of those about the final few days of Cleopatra's life? All of the plot within this, which mostly revolves around a love triangle between Cleopatra, who is fierce, and Mark Antony, who is hot, and Cleopatra's aide, who is a resentful lesbian who is in love with her. It's just all a downer the whole time. It plays into a lot of harmful bisexual tropes, honestly. Some of the music is fun, but it's not as fun as Oscar at the Crown. So it's hard for us to get into a show about all of these like political machinations between Egypt and Rome and all of this stuff going on. Too much of it was staged on the flat floor, so we couldn't even really see it. People weren't dancing. The atmosphere just wasn't there, and it couldn't decide whether it wanted to be powerfully sincere and serious or campy, because there was a drag queen MC, but it had too much of each and it didn't have a good mixture of the two. Okay, next up. What is next? Oh my gosh. Surrender. Okay, I really, really loved Bacon from the same playwright, Sophie Swithenbank, last year. This was a show for a solo performer, and it's about 2 different meetings that she is having. One with her daughter, who is visiting her in prison for the first time. Now, she's been imprisoned for neglect of that same daughter years before in childhood. We then flash between that and the meeting that she has with the police, where she is incarcerated, basically. But she's also talking to us, the audience. There's a sense of unreliable narrator. It's a very strong performance from her. I just don't really enjoy much about this writing. It has this annoying habit of having half of the conversations. I really hate this on stage, when someone says, when you imply the whole conversation, but you're only hearing half of it, and she's just responding with things like, well, no, you can say that, but, and it just gets uncomfortable to me. And it's not a very endearing character. A difficult play to latch on to and engage with emotionally. Okay, next up, still in 2-star territory here, Bell Ringers. Very well performed was Bell Ringers. I liked both of these actors, and I think I just have a tonal opposition to this one, because I'm not a fan of this kind of an abstract, Waiting for Godot-esque, there's a plane landing on my roof, Jesus, kind of like nothing happens. The idea is that they're in the midst of an enormous storm, like a biblical kind of a storm, and so many residents of the village and their family members and their friends' family members have died recently, like they're being punished by God or the gods. There's a little bit of an implication about like their servitude to religion, but its inability to keep people safe, because it's their shift basically ringing these bells to try and abate the storms, and they can hear the storm approaching from nearby villages. That gives us a sense of dramatic tension, but we just spend our whole time there waiting for their death as they do. And that's really all that there is to this play, and there's a lot of confusing moments within that. I think that's going to be my minute. Yes, it is. Okay, next up, There Will Be Dragons. I liked the writing of this, but this was performed by a student group, and there were a couple of odd choices. There was a lot of earnest charisma in their performance, and it's about college-age characters, so it felt very authentic for that reason. This is a musical that's been off Broadway, and it's about characters who are about to graduate, who have spent their entire college experience in a multi-year Dungeons and Dragons campaign, but on the last night before graduation, a lot of things go wrong. A lot of their friends go missing, and everyone's having an emotional breakdown because they're at this turning point in their lives, and so they then have to navigate the parties and like the campus as if it's the world of Dungeons and Dragons, and so they're going on this real life campaign together, and that's a very fun premise, and I like the way that this has been written. I think it's a lot to ask us to shift between the real world and the fantasy world with not much of a visual connection between where we are, with just like a black box staging and no mics. Please, if you're going to do a musical with solos, if it doesn't work in the space, you need to have microphones. Because I want to hear you. Next up, The Bookies. Starting my timer. This was a sort of a dark comedy play set in a betting shop. about its two members of staff, and the more senior of the two is expecting to be celebrated for his work and is finding out instead he is being made redundant. So he hatches a scheme to rob the place with the younger member of staff and one of these sort of like perpetually there customers who is also occasionally talking about his experience climbing Mount Everest multiple times. Hard to tie together the Everest of it all because he keeps having these like PTSD flashbacks to that experience. Hard to really connect what that means to the rest of this play, unless it's talking about kind of like this kind of addictive personality and the idea of risk and adrenaline. The whole thing takes a needlessly violent turn at the end. It feels a little bit more like television. There are a couple of dubious performances. I'm sorry to say there was one inexplicable Scottish accent. And it has its funny and its charming moments. Oh, but that's it. That's all I have to say. Next up, we're moving then up into the 3-star territory with a play called I Really Do Think This Will Change Your Life. Start the timer. So this one is about multi-level marketing schemes, pyramid schemes. And it's about a young woman who is trying to infiltrate and take one down from the inside. Some of the staging of this was really interesting. There are multiple screens behind her, and the text for the entire piece was being transcribed, and there was a lot done to try and make this a more accessible piece of theatre, which I celebrate. It was, however, and this was disclosed, one of the most like oppressive shows I saw in terms of the video and the audio. There was constant, it was very overstimulating to look at and to listen to. And also there were a lot of discrepancies between the text as performed and the text as transcribed, which got distracting. It was also very hard to tell where we were. And this became a sort of a heist storyline. How much of this is happening on a Zoom call? How much of this is happening in messages? How much of this is happening in real life? Because she's doing all the conversations and every side of this herself. You could use those visual elements on the screen to help us get there. But as it stood, it was confusing. Tit Swingers. Lesbian pirate musical. I love the energy. I love the characters. I love the charisma. I love the jokes. It had no business being as early in the afternoon as it was. It also deserves a much bigger audience and probably deserves a slightly different space. Somewhere like an Underbelly Cowgate. It wants a dingy sort of a cave. It wants to be in the back of a bar somewhere where people are drinking. It wants to feel like a rowdy pirate atmosphere full of drunk gay people. That is what this show needs and deserves. I like these writers. I like the music. I like the song about doing hot girl pirate shit. I liked the idea of telling these sort of forgotten historical stories and unearthing these real life queer characters from history. There could be more of a narrative around that. At the moment it's just like character presentation, like we're on stage in a band, and it doesn't quite do the thing that Six does of pulling the rug out from under itself and using theatrical techniques. It's just sort of more presentational. This could develop and grow into something further, and it needs to find the right kind of a space and atmosphere. But I like the vibes. I like the vibes a lot. Next up, Flicker. This is a very Fleabag adjacent play. Sort of, it feels like it is in an intentional way. It begins with a graphic sexual encounter, and you have this unlikable female protagonist who says every controversial thought that comes into her head, most of them explicitly sexual, and we come to find out that what's happening here is she is struggling with all of these intrusive thoughts and very concerned that they are what she really wants to do, that she really wants to like cause violence to a lot of people that she meets and do a lot of graphic sexual things. And so she is unable to act on her spontaneous feelings, her like first time queer feelings towards her housemate, because she's linked that to all the intrusive thoughts as well. It's also farcical. It doesn't need to have this farcical element. That is enough of a story. We don't need to do all this bloody slapstick and her trying to hide the hookup who's come round, and it takes a lot of dark turns. There's some really interesting dialogue here, and I don't think we've really explored this kind of a story about OCD before, and so there's a lot that I did like about it. Burning Down the Horse. Oh, I liked the energy here, and I loved it for the first 10 minutes, and then it just stayed the same for the next 50 minutes. And it's a sketch, basically. This is a comedy sketch about soldiers inside the Trojan Horse, and in fact, the whole audience, the whole thing takes place inside the Trojan Horse as it's getting ready to embark, but they are a bit reluctant, and not unlike a Horrible Histories or, you know, other things that have done this in the past, They are very like anachronistic, modern kinds of characters, and they just don't want to be soldiers. One of them has snuck wine on board, and they're chatting with people in the audience. The way they use the audience, brilliant in this. The way that they build this crowd sense, it's great, and it takes some interesting turns, but it's just far too long. It needs to develop in new directions. We need to flash back to other places. We need to get out of the horse. It's too long for us to be in the horse because there's only so much that they can do with this plot. There's so many mistaken deaths and this person being usurped and then that being undermined. It's too much. We have Solve It Squad. This is from Tin Can Bros, an offshoot of Team StarKid, right? I'm not familiar with a lot of StarKid stuff. This was my first time seeing something in person, and the idea of Solve It Squad is it's about these Scooby-Doo parody characters who years later, after having broken up and gone their separate ways, are reforming, but we meet them as adults experiencing all of the difficulties of and the realities of later adult life. One of them has become a drug addict. The other one is trying to sell old Solve It Squad merchandise out of his van. The other one is a struggling actress, and the Shaggy parody character now works for the FBI. I liked their use of all the Scooby-Doo style tropes, and they did one of those like corridor chase sequences, and there's a lot of humor here, and these performers are hilarious. I am confident that with a wittier script, this would be even funnier. The fans of this show, of which there were plenty, were loving every single thing that they were saying on stage. This could have been funny. It was charming. I liked it. It could have been better. Next up. Okay. Now we have I Wish You Well, the Gwyneth Paltrow ski trial musical. I enjoyed this. It's enjoyable. It's easy to just sit back and like, yeah, they're singing well and they're doing the Gwyneth Paltrow ski trial musical. And then you start to think, what is the point of this? What is the point of any of this? And what does it have to say? My issue with this one is it had no perspective on the Gwyneth ski trial. Its biggest focus was on the lawyer, the opposing lawyer, and her adoration of Gwyneth Paltrow, and the two of them becoming friends. And maybe it said a little bit about like women like being pitted against each other, maybe in celebrity culture, a teeny tiny bit. For the most part, it didn't really articulate anything bigger than itself, and again, it just felt like a parody sketch that overstayed its welcome. But it's this lawyer who ends up feeling like our principal character, and truly Tori Allen Martin did a fantastic job. I do love the song Goodbye to Park City, Utah. That may be one of the best songs of the Fringe for me. This was charming. I like these writers. I'm intrigued to see what else they do after this. I don't think we need Gwyneth Paltrow shows. Speaking of which, the next one, just slightly higher up on my list, is the other Gwyneth Paltrow show, Gwyneth Goes Skiing. Here we go. This one is from Linus Karp and Joseph Martin. And I like the way they use the audience. I like the way that they bring people on stage. I like the way that they expanded around the trial, so they flash back to the events before so that we could see them taking place. I liked the way that they used a puppet for the lawyer. Interesting, what happened when this show was announced is it got reported by the international media to be a musical, and so I think in response to that it kind of became a musical by necessity, and there's a lot of songs recorded by very famous artists that they lip sync to. This doesn't do a lot for me, especially when there are other moments when Joseph does sing as the puppet, and then we're connecting to that a lot more. The lip syncing moments don't provide enough, and I'm not sure I really bought Linus's delivery as Gwyneth Paltrow in the same way I did as Diana. Diana has that soft-spoken monotone thing that aligns with Linus's own delivery very well, but it was a little flat for Gwyneth, who is not high energy, but she's very difficult. I don't think either show really gave me a convincing Gwyneth parody, if I'm being completely honest, but this one at least had a perspective. A Jaffa Cake musical. So, this was by the same group that brought Scouts the Musical and Timpson the Musical, and I always think the concepts from the ones that I've seen are a lot more winning than the actual material. This was set inside of a courtroom, and it was all about this debate of whether Jaffa Cakes were cakes or biscuits in this landmark trial. And some of the songs arose from talking about Jaffa Cakes, but others were just like incidental, pointless musical theatre songs of just like, we've got to get it done, we've got to do the thing, and I'm never a fan of that. It just feels like laser. It just feels like you're trying to kill time, and these are not long shows. If you're trying to kill time, it means your concept is not big enough. And again, I just think one trial like this does not a whole show make. I did really like the staging. I liked the set elements, very clever. I liked the design, the way they incorporated orange and the Jaffa Cake colours, but we just weren't laughing enough. It was witty, it was making me smile a lot. It had a couple of really big laughs, but for a show like this, we need to be laughing constantly. And we weren't. Next up, Come Dine With Me. Again, we're in the realm of musical parody here. If you don't know, Come Dine With Me is a British TV show where strangers throw dinner parties for each other on consecutive nights, and at the end of the week, one of them is a winner. This was a musical parody of that, not unlike Bake Off, and I'll come back to that. What I liked about this was that we focused on the crew. It took this outside perspective when we followed the producer, the cameraman, and the sound guy. He is our nervous, anxious protagonist with a little bit of a forced love story. This is where the comparison to Bake Off comes in, because I thought the human element within Bake Off and its natural sincerity arose much better than the very forced romantic elements in this. I think a lot of this also got quite formulaic with the way we do like announcing the starter and then the main and then the dessert and then night 2 and then night 3 and night 4. Bake Off avoided that quite well by changing up the structure when it needed to so that it didn't get too repetitive or too easy to anticipate. Come Dine With Me started so strong and then just went off a little faster than I was hoping. Next up is The Gardening Club. We're still in 3-star territory here. Here we go. So this is a brand new musical, and I love this concept. This is set in the 60s, I believe, in the US and the American South, and it's about an underground drug ring where these young women were trying to illegally circulate the birth control pill, which at that time was only available to married women. So we meet all of these different women. We don't learn enough about what connects this initial group before they accept an unhappy wife neighbor into their group. We don't learn enough about why they're there in the first place. But I really like this music. Again, they didn't have microphones. They only presented the first act of the Fringe, which was a little bit puzzling. But I think this has an enormous amount of potential. In its current form, as it was at the Fringe, it wasn't the most satisfying thing because we ended on this cliffhanger. You couldn't hear what they were singing individually. You heard the group numbers, but especially when they were singing counterpoint, because they didn't have microphones, you just couldn't hear them. There are some really great characters. There is the attempt to tie too many of the characters into romantic pairings. We don't need all of that. I'm very excited to see where this goes, though. Very excited. Next up, Tones, a hip-hop opera. So, this was a story about a young man talking about his history with racial identity and class identity and the intersection of those two things, and sort of like where that situated him in education and how he was perceived by those around him, you know, not being a certain type of way for his own community, certainly not being considered as white enough within the realms of higher education and private education, and alongside his wealthy friends that he was making. And so it talks very interestingly about that. It's also told through the language of hip-hop and a kind of a post-Hamilton style, which was very expressive, brilliant storytelling. I really loved the way that was done. He's a really great performer of that. My bigger issue with this show is that we seem to do 2 or 3 narratives. His whole younger experience could have been a story all of its own because it came to quite a neat conclusion. But then we went to an older point of his life into higher education. That came to its own conclusion. And then we just sort of had to tack on this traumatizing ending. It felt a little bit unfocused. It felt like there were multiple good stories in there, but we needed to find a way to finesse them into something more overall when he's telling us these different parts of his life, I think. Next up, My English Persian Kitchen. I saw this show at Traverse. It is notable because the performer is also cooking live on stage, and the premise is that she is simultaneously preparing a meal for some guests who are going to be arriving in an hour. This gives us a sense of momentum throughout the thing, but she's also recalling through a veil of some trauma the circumstances under which she had to immigrate to the United Kingdom, and she had to leave from an abusive marriage. The problem is, all of these flashbacks that we get are scrambled out of order, and they come suddenly. They come as a result of the cooking, and they sort of follow the natural tension of the process that she is doing. And there comes a point quite early in the recipe that she has to throw everything into a pot, and it all simmers up with all of this steam, and that has to be the most dramatic part of the story, but it's quite early in the recipe. Under no other circumstances would you have the climax of the thing be that early. It also happens that there are moments later on that try and give us a sense of dramatic tension, but we already know that she's immigrated safely, so it's kind of impossible to do that. We have How I Learned to Swim. This is an interesting one. This was in the roundabout, and it's again for a solo performer, and talking about her traumatizing history as a young black woman with the water and with swimming. It talks a little bit about the relationship between black culture and swimming, but it doesn't explore that as much as I think it could. It's more about her and her own recent family experience and the disappearance of her brother, and she is trying to learn to swim so that she can go and look for him, sort of through this misguided guilt, because he's been missing for months, so clearly there's not a lot of logic to that decision. It does say interesting things about grief, and it metamorphosizes from this very down-to-earth and naturalistic play into something a little bit more fantastical, which is interesting but not necessarily to my personal liking. What I love about this are the moments where she connects with the other characters within the piece. Those are the most interesting parts of this for me, and not necessarily the last 10 minutes where it becomes a little bit more abstract. Next up, A Knock on the Roof at the Traverse Theatre. Very, very powerful piece about a woman living in Gaza who is training for the imminent bombing of her home because she's anticipating the knock on the roof, which is the first smaller bomb dropped on the roof of these apartment buildings to notify the residents that another bomb is going to be dropped within the next 5 to 15 minutes that will destroy the building. And so throughout the thing, she is over and over again practicing this process, working out how far she could run in that time, how far she could carry her child, how far she could carry all of the things from her home she would take with her, what she would take with her. All of which is naturally very intense, but the whole thing has a very laid-back and casual, almost comedic delivery throughout, and there are moments that get a little bit more heavy, but for the most part it is surprisingly detached from the imminent danger of it all, which perhaps is the reality, far be it from me to say otherwise, but it makes a few puzzling decisions. It's also a little bit green and a little bit rough around the edges as far as one-person shows go. I'm finished, I'm sorry. Next up was Hyper. Now this one was more interesting for the way that it was staged than the story it was actually telling, because it's about a young trans woman, but it does so many things to situate an audience, a nondescript audience, anyone may be seeing this show, to kind of engage with this character in a responsible way and in a receptive way. And it's kind of asking the question, how far do we have to go with this piece of theatre to get you to really listen to this trans woman? So she is portrayed by a cis woman in the space, and this trans performer is behind a translucent screen using vocal modifying technology in order to alter the pitch of her speaking voice, and it's telling the story about a performance occasion when she was misgendered, and we as the audience have to participate in this transphobic act. Very interesting, very powerful, but really interesting staging choices. The Mosney Project. Oh, I struggled with this one, and I'm sure it's smarter than I really was able to grasp at the time, and I think I just didn't understand it fundamentally. This was from Counterfactual, this was at Underbelly Cowgate, and it was about a real historic day when the town of Mosney in Wisconsin was occupied in a fake invasion by anti-communists in the midst of the whole McCarthyism, Red Scare era, to try and illustrate the real dangers of communism. It was very devised, and I liked a lot of what they did with cameras and with screens showing us different things. It was all very carefully and steadily and sort of unemotionally brought about, but it had this sort of a journalistic, emotional detachment. They were performing it a little dispassionately, and we didn't have a lot of avenues through which to care, nor did they seem to have a strong enough perspective on what it meant to them or the significance of the whole thing. They just sort of presented it. It was a really good secondary school, A-level history project. Wasn't a compelling piece of theatre for me. Our Little Secret, the 23andMe musical. This one was all the passion, all the heart. This was a solo performer. This was an award-winning piece of musical theatre in Canada, and it's about his experience of discovering that the man who raised him as his son was not his biological father, that he was conceived via an anonymous sperm donor, and how this affects him, and him trying to find out who this man was, finding out that he has siblings who also found this out about themselves. It is a musical. The lyrics are a little bit repetitive, and the music I would describe as being very familiar of children's TV music writing in a sort of an odd way, but it's a very charming show. It's a great show to see with your family. It came across as oddly selfish at the end, and there is a circling back to how much his parents mean to him, but I feel like a finer point needed to be put on that, because it does feel like a lot of the show happens at their expense, and he talks about the idea of them eventually coming round to the idea of him telling people, but for the most part, they initially ask him not to, and then he does an entire show about it. Bird watching. This was a play with 3 performers that I saw in the space, and they have gone camping. Again, they are about to, I think, like finish secondary school and go on with the rest of their lives. One of them's going to university. Another one is moving to Australia. She's planning not to come back, although she hasn't revealed that yet. But they are wild camping somewhere illegally in the creepy woods. This is a horror play, and they find out as they're playing games with each other and getting increasingly uncomfortable in these very tense woods, that there are unspoken things between them, unspoken histories, and not every one of these friendships is as close or unbreakable as the others, and arguments arise, and there's these creepy birds they keep seeing in the trees. I think we could do without the fantastical creepy bird element. I think these characters in this story is strong enough that we don't need the horror aspect of it all or the ambiguous ending, but it does have an interesting narrative about violence and the violence that they've each experienced in the way that they've all felt perceived throughout their lives as young women. Next up, Weather Girl. My gosh, this is a very urgent, very intense piece of theatre talking about climate change. She is a weather girl in California, played by Julia McDermott, who does a fantastic job with this relentless performance and this facade of her life, behind which is all of this trauma and anxiety and concern about these rapidly spreading Californian wildfires that she ends up driving through, and her life within days has turned into enormous chaos. But it doesn't, the level of tension in this piece doesn't ebb and flow. It just mounts. It's just completely cumulative. The space is slowly filling with haze. And much like this video, it just keeps going and going and going and going. We can't catch our breaths, which perhaps is a great allegory for climate change, but it makes for a slightly challenging piece of theatre. A lot of other people really loved this. I did not latch onto it. I couldn't find a way to engage with it. I thought she was a great character. I wanted to see more of her everyday life juxtaposed with this. I thought if we flashed to and from those 2 points, that would have been more effective. I keep overrunning these minutes, I'm sorry. Next up, Silence the Musical, parody of Silence of the Lambs, which I have never seen. How could I possibly enjoy a parody musical? Well, it's funny regardless. The jokes that they make, I know enough of the cultural references within Silence of the Lambs, and those characters and Clarice and Hannibal Lecter, and it puts the lotion on the skin and all that stuff, to appreciate it. It was also just outrageous and shocking and very adult. Do not take children to this one whatsoever. But I enjoyed it. It was like a really great late night show to go see at the Fringe. The choreography was inspired in a sort of a perverted and demented way. But, you know, they just did a great job in taking this beloved film and quite insincerely turning it into this joke. It got a lot of laughs. It got a lot more laughs than a lot of the other comedy musicals that I saw at the Fringe. Phoebe Panaratos did a fantastic job as Clarice, and I enjoyed it. There was a lot to enjoy about this. Love's a Beach. This was a 2-person play about a gay couple. They were the first ever same-sex winners of this Love Island-esque dating show, which is not really named, and it's not what the play is about. I thought it was going to spend more time covering that, but we meet them afterwards when they are this influencer power couple talking through brand deals that they need to get done, talking about the realities of influencer life, and for the most part, it is one of the more accurate depictions of the influencer lifestyle and what that kind of work actually looks like that I've seen on stage. There are still some inaccuracies, and we begin to see this fracture in their relationship. One of them cares only about followers. The other one wants to try and use his platform for good. One of them goes to Dubai despite the whole anti-gay thing. The other one is just obsessively helping loads of different animals. And it gets to be, it's at its best when it's being comedic, when it tries to be really sincere about their relationship. We haven't earned that. It hasn't spent enough time developing them as a couple for us to really care about that. Giant on the Bridge. This was a really beautifully collaborative piece of theatre, all about convicts returning home to their families and what that means for them emotionally and what it means for their families emotionally. And we had music written by the actual prison inmates as part of this development program, and we had fantasy, like medieval storytelling, and we had this narrative about an actual guy leaving the prison system and the family that he is going home to, what that means for him or what it means for them. I wonder if a broader look at this that used more different perspectives and more different stories might do a better job of articulating these emotions. It also kept telling us that they were just feeling conflict and angst and like feeling all of these different things, but without articulating what those different things were. The music, though, I really loved. Folky, a little bit Dave Malloy-esque. And I thought it was just a beautiful creative collaboration of all of these different elements. Next up, we have a show called Blubber. This was from Katie Greenall. I'd really loved a show of hers I'd seen a few years before called Fatty Fat Fat. This one was a little bit more mournful in tone. It began with her doing this synchronized swimming presentation and talking to the audience about synchronized swimming. The relationship with the audience felt very natural and very easy. We felt very welcomed into this, and by the end of the piece, audience members were actually welcomed on stage to go and help sort of baptize Katie into this new acceptance with her body and kind of like wash her on stage. There were a lot of water elements. I really loved the set design of this in this quite limiting space. There were these poetic sections I thought were just beautiful, and she said the most profound things about her relationship to her body that within the context of this show was a character of its own, and it was about how the two of them had, I guess, grown apart and her relationship to her body. But I did want the synchronized swimming thing to come back. I did think that would have been a more satisfying narrative, but that is not what happened in her life. Next up, we're in 4-star territory here, by the way, since Silence the Musical. Next up, we have Barbara and Kenneth. So this was TikTok star Diana Giulietti starring in a show about Barbie that doesn't use Barbie because licensing, that I believe was created before the Barbie movie. The issue that it now has is it doesn't tell us a lot the Barbie movie it doesn't. However, the way Barbie is presented here, she's a lot more sardonic, she's a lot more honest, she's very Britney post-conservatorship, in fact, where she's talking about all the difficult things she's had to go to. This worked at the Fringe because of Diana, because of how incredibly talented she is. It was a brilliant showcase for her talents and why she needs to be in Legally Blonde yesterday. She's fantastic, she's charismatic, she's a great singer, she's like doing gymnastics on stage, changing between all of these different outfits, great outfits. They got the Barbie energy down. I believed her as this character. I liked that it showed all of the different Barbie jobs and it linked them to different historical women who had done those jobs and actual historical athletes and historical astronauts. And yeah, I liked that element of it where it felt more grounded in reality. Next up, main character energy. This was a performer called Temi at the Roundabout, and she is a classical actress who is talking about kind of like the struggles that she's had to reconcile the way that she walks through life with main character energy and the roles that she's been relegated to in professional productions. How, longing to be Juliet in Romeo and Juliet. What's really interesting about this, predominantly it's just hugely entertaining. She's a fantastic presence to watch on stage, and I've not seen an audience get into it as quickly because she demands attention. She enters this space and tells you that you love her, and then you do because she's so damn charismatic with it. What's interesting about it is she talks about the casting in the recent Jamie Lloyd Romeo and Juliet and the backlash to it, and the way that that kind of shakes her. And I like that it was that pertinent and it was that current, talking about that thing that happened a few months ago. And this is one of those pieces where it kind of like starts to fall apart and uses that as a theatrical technique, whereas like she's not telling the story that she'd planned to tell. It's a little messy the way that it does that, but I also like that it feels very real. The Emu War. This feels like an Australian Operation Mincemeat, but at a kind of an earlier stage. This could be developed much further. If they took a lot of these songs and just did them twice as fast, it would be great, because this show asks the slightly puzzling question, do you know what's funny? Ballads. It's about an actual conflict between the Australian government and an emu population that the Australian government, spoiler alert, did not win. They create the emus on stage using puppets, using like sock puppets on their hands and doing this. That's hilarious. There's a lot of really great comedy in this. Like Operation Mincemeat, it also attempts some more sincere and serious moments. We need to laugh more so that we can pivot harder into those, but the concept here is one I really enjoy. The characters, I really enjoy. It has some beautifully absurd characters and some moments of real brilliant nonsense. I like an awful lot about this, and I think it could grow into something even more ridiculous and great. Janie D's Beautiful World Cabaret. I love Janie D. She is a magnificent performer, and getting to experience her in an intimate setting, the Edinburgh Fringe, is such a treat. But not only that, this show has an important message. She is advocating for the planet and for us having a more positive and receptive relationship to the planet. She said she was inspired by her children protesting while she was performing in Follies at the National Theatre, and so she is singing Sondheim. She's singing beautiful songs in this. She's singing comedy songs. We get to see that sparkling Janie D wit and that brilliant character actress that she is. She has other performers, musicians, dancers, singers with her on stage. Ed Zanders accompanying her. It's a really well put together cabaret, but it's this meaningful through line through it all that elevates it to something beyond that. But the status that she affords it as well, playing this space as if it's the Royal Albert Hall, is what makes it a shimmering afternoon. Really enjoyed. Tim Murray is Witches. I've been really excited to see this for a long time because I think Tim Murray is very funny. I've seen a lot of his stuff on social media. I didn't realize how personal this show was going to be, that it would be so much about his childhood being obsessed with different pop culture witches like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, like Charmed, like The Craft, and then like Wicked. And all sorts of different witches, but it becomes, not unlike My Son's a Queer, but What Can You Do, a lot about the sort of the relatable young queer experience, or even just like the young outsider experience, and coming to terms with loving the things that you love unashamedly. There are also original songs he's created for this show that are very funny. Often I hear original songs in a comedy show and I'm rolling my eyes, but these are really good. And the way that he does crowd work is so positive, is so friendly, is so charming, is so open, and he puts so much of himself out there. There's a really beautiful spirit to this show, and he gets to play Guess That Alphabet, where he plays different alphabet clips, and you have to guess which one it is, which I very much enjoyed as well. And who wouldn't? Who among us would not? Diary of a Gay Disaster. Oh, how to explain this in 1 minute. Okay, so you have these 3 queer characters who are brought together in this, like, fantasy dream realm to try and work through some stuff they haven't unpacked via the diary of a gay disaster, talking about like lesbian experiences. What I like about this is it's so specific to the lesbian experience. The songs are really great. It's got some really great bops in there as well. These are really well-developed characters. They offer us so many different insights into this experience. We meet a bisexual character. We talk about the intersection of sexuality with gender, with a non-binary character. But it talks about all of these very real things, and it's not giving you the queer experience for a heterosexual audience and from a heterosexual perspective. It's not giving you like we talk about some of those things, but it's not doing like the coming out story and the first line, like all of those things. We're really getting down to the nitty gritty of the actual issues faced by the community. It feels very authentic in that way. Next up, VL. So this is a sequel to a play I think called Square Go that it was at the Fringe a few years before. It's about these 2 characters who are in school and they're on their way to a dance, and they're very anxious not to be perceived as VLs, which is to say that they've never been kissed. And they're really funny characters. It does feel more like it feels like characters from a Little Britain-esque sketch show that have been given their own like hour to explore some stand-up. It doesn't feel like it justifies its theatricality. It doesn't feel like something I need to be sitting and seeing in a theatre. The performers are brilliant. The way that they play off each other, the rapport that they have, the characterizations, it's so funny. This is giving you constant laughs, so it's really entertaining to see at a theatre, and it doesn't really have any shortcomings. I really enjoyed it. I just don't know if it feels like theatre necessarily. Next up, 300 Paintings. So this, from an Australian former stand-up comedian named Sam. This talks about a manic episode that he had where over the period of 6 months he created 300 different pieces of art, and his creativity during this time became rapid and cumulative, and he turned to invention, and then he was like selling his inventions to different people but behaving in this very bizarre way. This was a completely wild piece of storytelling that was like sort of TED Talk esque because he's showing us these different pieces of art as a presentation. It also felt a little bit like stand-up comedy. I had no idea how to end, which is the biggest shortcoming of the thing, but I thought he was brilliant. The art, compellingly fantastic, and one of the most engaging stories. You are with him the whole time, and you can't believe every subsequent decision he is making. It's just more and more shocking, constantly entertaining. It just doesn't end. It simply doesn't know how to. To Free a Mockingbird. So this is the solo show from my friend Grace Archie, one of the funniest people I know in real life and an integral part of the Broadway marketing machine. She's an amazing creative multi-hyphenate, and this is a very personal solo show about her own family and also about grief. What I love about this, the way that she circles and spirals in towards herself as the center of the story through previous generations. And as she gets closer and closer and closer, unsurprisingly, it becomes more personal. It becomes less comedic. It starts out very funny. It starts out like a hyper trivia quiz host telling you a fascinating story about their life. And then it gets more profound. It gets more emotional. And we hit a lot of the beats that have been foreshadowed earlier in the thing. It is one of the most personal stories I think I saw at this entire Edinburgh Fringe. She's a brilliant storyteller. And I really loved this. I think this piece could be developed for something bigger than itself as well, actually. Next up, Pop Off Michelangelo. Okay, this is... Oh, I haven't started my timer. There we go. This is a musical about Michelangelo and Da Vinci and debunks their supposed rivalry and instead has them as young gay best friends. And it's this very anachronistic, super campy, littered with musical theatre references and other gay culture references and pop culture references, story about them going to art school and trying not to let anyone know that they're gay because the Pope is currently being super homophobic. And then Marissa Tomei appears. It's wild, it's hilarious, but it's the references that made me fall in love with this. My goodness, these references. I also really liked the music as well and the song Pop Off Michelangelo. Yeah, this one will make you scream laughing if you're any kind of a musical theatre fan. I wanted the design to be better. I wanted, because it's talking so much about their artistic brilliance and all the things they're painting and sculpting. We don't see any of that, but also the way that the set is designed, A, unhelpful for its staging because they kept having to move these columns around needlessly and these overlong blackouts, and B, just didn't look very creatively exciting. Next up, The Long Run. I cried my eyes out. My goodness. This piece from Katie Arnstein and the New Diorama Theatre, it's an incredible story. And this is the one, I don't know whose job it is to find pieces of theatre and turn them into films. This needs to be a film. I liked the story, but I don't think it was sort of vitally theatrical. More people should see it to experience this story because it's so profoundly human and so real and so British and so authentic and so honest. But it would be an incredible film. This is about Katie taking her mother to go get cancer treatments and waiting in sort of the post-pandemic years in this socially distanced waiting room and meeting the other people who are also there with their people and encountering an old man who is running backwards and forwards down the corridors. This ends up making her very frustrated, and after an argument, they begin to develop this friendship. He's training for the London Marathon in memory of his late partner. I can't even talk about it because I'm going to cry. It ends with this race. It does some exciting things theatrically, but it would be better as a film, I think. Did you mean to fall like that? This is the story of a recently divorced man. Well, he's separated and he's coming to terms with that. And he's kind of exploring his romantic possibilities. And very naturally, and quite late on in the play, arises this friendship he strikes up with another man that turns into something more romantic. And it's not a very heavy-handed way of him going like, am I bi now? And having a whole crisis about it. That's really over and done within a couple of seconds. And that feels very natural. And I appreciated that. It doesn't feel full of those sort of gay theatre tropes. It feels less like a show about bisexuality for men later in life, and it feels more just like a show about divorce, honestly, and all of the different components of that. And the queer aspect of it is just one small detail of it, but it's much more about his mental state while he's going through this period of immense change. I liked the three pieces of wood around the space that formed like a tightrope for him to balance on, and also gave him some business while moving them around and like trying to keep everything in order and trying to maintain normalcy while everything else changes. And brilliantly performed as well. He was so charismatic. Next up, A History of Paper. This was two-person musical at the Traverse. Very sadly, one of the writers of this, the playwright, tragically passed away at the very end of last year. This is a beautiful love story about two people, Scottish people, who find each other in the days approaching the millennium, the year 2000. We then see these snapshots from their life together and these little details about their life together. And what ends up happening, this is going to be a massive spoiler, I apologize, but I kind of need to talk about it, is she dies on 9/11 because she has a job interview in New York. It's a little bit of a justification of the plot to get them there, and I don't know how I feel about 9/11 being invoked as a plot device here, but, you know, I'll leave that for other people to decide how they feel about it. I think for us to be more invested in his grief, we need to be more invested in them as a couple. Their initial meeting is very cute. I like a lot of the music. I want to know just more little details about their life. We spend a lot of time with his mindset and her mindset about each other, and I want to know more of the little things that made their life together. I feel like the death comes too soon into the relationship for us to mourn it as much as he does. I've gone way over my 1 minute. I apologize. Next up, Play Fight. I really loved the writing here. I could live in this writing and with these characters for a long time. This could be TV, actually. This could be a whole limited series. It's about these three young women who are friends, who are meeting at this tree, and the meetings that they have and the times that they meet up throughout their like secondary school experience, every time they would come together at this tree. And what it is each of them is on the precipice of like sexual awakening and discovery as young women, which manifests differently for each of them. One of them has a queer identity discovery. The other one is probably repressing some of that because she is very connected to her religion, and the third is making sort of like potentially dangerous choices within that realm. But these characters are so well written. It could probably tie together a little more neatly, but I really liked much of the writing of this, and I think a lot of other people would as well. Next up, Nation. This was from the same group who created We Were Promised Honey. This one a little less interactive with the audience, or at least that's how it seems initially. So a story is being told here by this storyteller, and it's very ethereal, it's very abstract, and the idea is that everyone is at a party, and the people in this sort of idyllic community start to notice things going wrong, things going missing, changes to the otherwise perfect community after the arrival of a stranger. And it invokes the idea of like just some sort of someone outside of the community entering it. We could talk about immigration, we could talk about someone from like a queer community in a heteronormative culture. It's not specific, and I think without that specificity it loses a little bit of its punch, but where it tries to find a punch is a member of the audience stands up and participates in the show, and they haven't been a member of the audience the entire time later on in the show, and that delivers a little bit of a moment of shock, but that dialogue itself could still just have a little bit more punch. But I really liked the way this story was told. Same team. This was a bit like the play Dear England, but in Scotland and for girls. This was about a group of women who were competing in the Homeless World Cup. It was part of a sort of like a community opportunity. They had formed a football team, and each of them has reasons for being there, whether they have recently left the prison system. One of them is a young carer. The other one is struggling financially after a divorce later in life. One of them is a former addict, and it's about the bond that they find through this. I really like the way that the football moments are staged. This is in the larger space at the Traverse. They're setting up microphones, commentating, I should say, and you can visualize every single moment of these football games, and you feel so inspired by it. I suddenly understood why sports fans love watching football so much, because you do cheer for these outcomes. You do come to really care about these characters. There's a beautiful spirit to this show. Hannah Jarrett Scott gives a fantastic performance. Huge amount of heart in the same team. Next up, So Young. Take a shot every time I say grief, because once again, this was a great show about grief. It's about an older couple, and maybe the spark has started to... They're trying to rekindle the spark in their relationship, but they are going for dinner with a friend of theirs who has recently lost his wife, who was also a very close friend of theirs. The four of them used to be this sort of quartet of friendship, and unexpectedly, the dinner is about him introducing them to his very young new girlfriend only a few months after his wife's passing, because again, this is in the days after COVID, this is set in the years after COVID, before they've had the chance to have a proper funeral celebration. And this could go to a lot more destructive Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf-esque places, but it doesn't, and I appreciate that. Instead, we get 4 really interesting perspectives on grief and how they each feel about this and how it affects them all. And I thought that was done really powerfully, and some fantastic performances. I'm almost there. This again, this defies 1 minute, my goodness. This is a musical monologue written and performed by Todd Almond, and the musical style, very Jason Robert Brown, very Dave Malloy, very Sondheim, and it goes to an abstract place. It's all about him having met a nice man at brunch, and after they have this fantastic first day together, on a subsequent day, the man is bringing him coffee, and he is downstairs outside his apartment building, and the show is all about him trying to get downstairs, but running into these different neighbours, and it becomes increasingly abstract and increasingly strange and fantastical. And what's happening here is each of these neighbors seems to represent something that he has to get past in his own psyche, in his own heart, in order to open himself up to the possibility of this relationship, of, being worthy of it, and everything that might mean, and like the fear that he will die alone, and the like fears of the way that he is perceived by people, and all this other stuff. Really great music, beautiful musical storytelling and musicianship, very interesting premise. Who Do You Love? The Casey and the Sunshine Band musical. My God, did this surprise me, because I was just expecting this to be a quite generic jukebox show that felt more like a tribute show, and while it does depict Harry Casey, the creator of Casey and the Sunshine Band, it's about him wanting to musicalize the story of his life, and his friends sort of helping him to do that. And it's very meta, because they're talking about like, well, this is where you'd have an I Want song, and this would be great for an 11 o'clock number, and encouraging him to explore the harder parts of his life as well as the good times, invoking lots of references to other different musicals. Structurally, this was way smarter and more thoughtful, and with a lot more heart than I was anticipating, but also it gave you all those really crowd-pleasing, entertaining elements. Great opening number, great costumes, really fantastic cast, brilliant vocals. I actually went to go see this twice because I enjoyed it that much. So yeah, Who Do You Love? Casey and the Sunshine Band musical. Surprised the hell out of me. Okay, my camera died because even it could not take this much theatre criticism, but we have only 10 shows left. My top 10 shows of the Edinburgh Fringe 2024, and here they are. Beginning with The Sound Inside at the Traverse Theatre by Adam Rapp. This play has been on Broadway. This play has been nominated for Tony Awards, so I don't really know what it was doing at the Edinburgh Fringe, but I really enjoyed it. This was about 2 writers. One of them is a professor at Yale, I believe. The other one is this sort of isolated young student who spends more and more time with her after the 2 of them have this intellectual conversation during her office hours. She is also diagnosed with a very late stage form of cancer that she doesn't want to get treated, but it's her experience with him that changes her mind about this. It has a very fascinating ending that leaves a lot to interpretation, but this is a play about writers, and this is a play about writing, the language that it uses and the way that each of them expresses themselves through their writing, and what we learn about them through their perceptions of the world and of each other, and this fascinating dynamic between the 2 of them. Brilliant performances, particularly from the leading actress. I like that it began as what felt like a monologue, and then he kind of broke through that and defied her description of him in the 3rd person. Next up, oh no, I've lost the page. Oh no, it's all going wrong. Number 9 at the Fringe, One Man Musical by Flo and Joan. What this actually is Andrew Lloyd Webber, the musical. This is a comic biography parody by musical comedy geniuses Flo and Joan, all about the big man himself, Andrew Lloyd Webber. And he is portrayed as this very charismatic, I guess, Etonian, upper middle class maestro who is finally telling his own story. They don't use his music, but they do invoke his musical style very well and very cleverly. It sounds like Andrew Lloyd Webber music, and they use a lot of details about his life and about his shows, and a lot of brilliant in-jokes. Chances are you all are going to really enjoy this. I think, I don't know how long this is going to be able to go on, or where it's going to be able to have a future life because of the law, because they do use his name and many details about his life. But it is, even if this was just a generic comedy character who wasn't Andrew Lloyd Webber, so brilliantly performed, Very, very funny. Just really excellent. Dylan Mulvaney's solo show, Fag Hag. So Dylan Mulvaney, huge social media influencer, star and performer who has spent the past few years very openly documenting her transition and her journey in girlhood and womanhood. And this show, on her own terms, kind of recounts all of that and kind of her experience of feeling like a woman trapped in the body of a young gay twink and kind of the struggles through that, but done in this very campy and kitsch way. This is not hard-hitting, heavy trauma. This is like this rose-tinted perspective on a very difficult adolescence and then a very difficult recent few years. It talks about everything that, if you've been paying attention, you already know happened to Dylan Mulvaney. It's great to hear her perspective on it fully, and they use some really brilliant theatrical techniques to do that, and a couple of songs which are fine. I want to know more beyond that. It would have been great to find out more kind of like the future and the wider like what we don't know about Dylan Mulvaney, I guess. But what a brilliant performer. My God, is going to have a huge career on stage. Swamplesque, the Shrek Burlesque. This was a last minute addition. I'm so glad we went to see this. It's exactly what it sounds like. This is an Australian show, and it's a raunchy burlesque performance using the characters from Shrek. And it's so entertaining. It's brilliant because you have this generation, my generation, who grew up loving Shrek, and then Shrek became a meme, but there really is this enduring fondness for Shrek, and it's an itch you can't scratch by going to see like the stage show, because that's geared towards family audiences and kids. But you go see something subversive and adult like this. You go see the gingerbread man stripping off each of their limbs, turning their head around, and then taking the buttons off the costume and putting them back on nipple pasties to the Pussycat Dolls song "Loosen Up My Buttons." You go see like suggestive Lord Farquaad. So creative, honestly, more creative and innovative than productions of Shrek the Musical I have recently seen. And also there's this whole underlying message about body positivity and like breaking the conventions of like body types within burlesque. Brilliant, genius, genuine high art. I'm not even kidding. Next up, Diva Live from Hell. I had seen this before and loved it. I loved it even more again at the Fringe. Luke Bayer. What a star is Luke Bayer, and what a perfect role this is for him and his talents. Combine All About Eve and Rachel Berry from Glee, and you get this maniacal, high school, malevolent story about Desmond Channing, the president of the drama club, and this newcomer named Evan, who is accidentally kind of dismantling everything that Desmond has built for himself. There's a little bit of a sense of like repressed homosexuality in there as well. Some brilliant songs, but it's everything Luke does in this show. It's such a brilliant showcase of his talents and his different characterizations. His Desmond is thrilling and terrifying, but it's his performance as Evan when he's doing all these like 90s boy band bro things like, it's so funny, and he's such a brilliant wit. There is such a timing and a musicality to his comedy. It's so good. My Mother's Funeral. Oh, I loved this. Oh my gosh, I loved this. This was at Roundabout, and it's about a playwright who, in the immediate days after the death of her mother, is trying to make arrangements for this and trying to prepay for funeral expenses. And like I said, a lot of shows about grief at the Edinburgh Fringe this year. This is the one that was the most analytical and talking in the most detail about the challenging logistics of grief and the financial inevitability of grief. And so to try and fund this funeral, she is trying to hastily put together a piece of theatrical work, because this is the only way that she can make the money that she needs to. She can get a commission on this, and she's trying to sell it to a theatre, but they want to try and morph it into something that it isn't, and try and like commodify her working class background. The way this is staged is so brilliant. The actors in this were so fantastic. This is just a genuinely thrilling, fantastic, wonderful, incredible piece of theatre. I've run out of smart things to say. I'm just giving you adjectives at this point. Next up, oh my God, this is 2 shows in one. Half Man, Half Bull, parts 1 and 2. This is gig theatre. Think Hadestown meets the Choir of Man. We're all sat around, and a group of brilliant musicians are telling Greek mythology stories through contemporary acoustic music. And it's beautiful, and it's soaring, and it's powerful. The first part is all about Theseus and the Minotaur, but it's the second part about Daedalus and his son Icarus, but about his experience as a parent who has lost his son that is the most beautiful. My goodness, there's a moment in it where we all make these paper airplanes and throw them across the auditorium for a few minutes, and from such joy, it gives way to such despair. But what I love about this is that the Greek myths are there, and if you care at all about Greek mythology, there's so much interest in there and the way that they make them feel contemporary and modern, but also none of it really matters, because what this is about is the prevailing emotions of it all. Like, we can't necessarily relate to this Greek mythological persecution. The camera died again. The technology does not want me to tell you about how much I enjoyed this piece of theatre, but I did. I think what I was saying was we may or may not relate to those specific Greek mythological themes, but what we do relate to are the emotional themes that transcend the piece. Brilliant community building within the space, incredible music, fantastic storytelling, perfect theatrical experience. Next up, number 3, my third favourite show of the Fringe, June Carter Cash. Where's my timer? There it is. So this is not the show that it sounds like it is. This is from Charlene Boyd, actress and now playwright, who has created a piece in tribute to the life of pioneering country musician and mother June Carter Cash, and talks about the parallels that she discovered between June's life and her own, as she, again, post-lockdown and in the midst of lockdown, was trying to be a newly divorced mother to her 2 kids and trying to balance that with a creative career, much like June balanced motherhood, divorce, creative career. All of those things. Talks about her going to Nashville and experiencing all of this. Music runs through the heart of this piece with fantastic musicians on stage, but the staging of it, the way that it's directed, the set design of this, with us all sat at these different tables, and on each of them are different parts of her life that she is moving between. One of them is a dishwasher that she dives into. She is changing. She gradually becomes less June and more herself, which reflects what happens within the piece as she becomes more honest and discovers that this is a story about herself and not the story about June that she thought she was trying to tell. Oh, that's the end, but I loved it. Oh my god. Next up. Every brilliant thing. Every time I've told someone I love this play, they've said, yeah, that's old news, and they already knew about it. So this is from Duncan Macmillan, performed by Johnny Donoghue, who is returning to the play. And the premise is it's about a young boy who, after one of his mother's suicide attempts, starts compiling a list in childhood about every extraordinary thing worth living for in the world. And as you'd expect, they're very juvenile at the beginning, sort of delightfully adolescent, like ice cream and staying up late to watch films and seeing people falling over. And then he rediscovers this list later in life a few times, and it goes with him through more chapters of his life. And it becomes about older, more meaningful things, but there's so many pieces of paper handed to the audience to read out things when he says items from the list. Those are all created by members of the audience. There are a couple of roles played by members of the audience. I have never seen better community building in the theatre than in this space. Instant standing ovation, huge amount of love in the room, just extraordinary, transcendent, meaningful, brilliant theatre. Okay, this camera is trying to destroy me, but I am not weak. Theatre makes me strong. I have 1 minute to tell you about my favourite show of the Fringe, Cyrano at the Traverse. Here we go. This was an interpretation, a queer interpretation of Cyrano by Australian theatre maker Virginia Gay, and it was extraordinary. Stripped back to its most essential parts, going a little bit deliberately off-piste and kind of pulling away from the traditional Cyrano de Bergerac story, taking exactly what it needed to in order to reframe this as a story about a brilliant, inspiring, intellectual queer woman whose gender was the thing separating her from the love that she perceived herself to be worthy of, which kind of like took this very classic story and made it newly relevant to an extraordinary breadth of audience. This was damn near a perfect theatrical experience. The language of this, the performances of this, the staging, the way that it invoked its audience, it was so celebratory, it was so sad when it needed to be. This had everything, and it's coming to the Park Theatre in London later this year, and I implore you to go and see it if you didn't get a chance to see it in Australia or at the Fringe. But I thought it was just fantastic. One of the many brilliantly creative things I saw this year at the Edinburgh Fringe. My goodness, if that felt a little rushed, I am sorry. If you want to go and hear my fuller thoughts on each of those, you can find them on Threads and on TikTok. Go and check them out over there. In the meantime, I'm going to have an enormous glass of wine. Thank you for joining me for my roundup of this year's Edinburgh Fringe. I will be back next year at the Fringe. There'll be videos prior to that next year about my recommendations for the Fringe. If there's anything else you would like to know, drop it in the comments. In the meantime, thank you for watching this video. The camera is trying to end again, so we don't have much time. I hope that everyone is staying safe and that you have a stagey day. For 10 more seconds, I'm MickeyJoTheatre. Oh my god, hey. Thanks for watching, have a stagey day. Subscribe!